Have you ever wondered how some words have become sorted into a special magic pile called hypnotic language, as opposed to every other kind of language that there is? You know, we talk about hypnotic language as if it's somehow unique and special and apart from everything else. Well, you see, the thing is, if you've studied hypnosis and you've studied some hypnotic language patterns, I'd be willing to bet you join most people who have trained in hypnosis before and bought into the idea that there's some kind of magic words, some kind of magic language, that if you use them or if you say them using the hypnotic language is the same thing as creating hypnosis or being a hypnotic trance or something like that. In other words, these special words equal hypnosis. And the problem is, there are no special magic words that are just words for hypnosis. How we use language, the way in which we take the structures and the possibilities that are there in language and then translate them through intention into statements, into utterances, into interactions with other people, are not determined by the category or class. It's not like Harry Potter. It's not like waving a magic wand and then suddenly something magical happens. We have these ideas that there's a magic place called trance, and that if you run through a specific protocol or a specific procedure, that then you get a ticket to go there. There's a place called the unconscious, somewhere deep in there, in the back. You know, you've been there a few times. You know how, when you, and as you sit there, and your hand is moving down towards you. All of these places and magical phrases and ways of talking that are the equivalent of something that we call hypnosis and that we think is valuable. I'd like to offer you a different possibility. We don't know what hypnosis is. We don't know what trance is. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we've called and labeled trance and hypnosis and hypnotic process. But that's just a way of talking about how two people or more people come together in order to create change. You know, if you look at books that were written about hypnosis from the 19th century or the 20th century, you know, when Freud was playing with it, they had a whole bunch of different behaviors that they would engage in, different ways of talking, different things that they'd point attention to, that they called the hypnotic process, the hypnotic procedure, and the hypnotic trance, that are quite different from, say, the kinds of things that Clark Hull was looking at in the 1930s, compared with the kind of things that ERICKSON did in the 60s and 70s, compared with the kind of things that you might be doing, or somebody you know who works with hypnosis might be doing in their practice today. Those ways of behaving, the ways of interacting, for the large part, they're social constructs. They are just how people interact. And when we're talking about hypnosis, hypnotherapy, there's an awful lot of taboo. There's an awful lot of, it must be this and it's only that and it can't be any other way. This kind of ritualism and dogmatism that comes from not actually dealing with the specifics of human behavior, the things that can be observed, lots and lots of abstractions, abstract labels. Anytime you've got a process that has lots of different ways to describe it, lots of abstract labels, you can then have priesthoods. And those priesthoods can then debate and discuss and contradict one another. One of the things that happened quite early on in my training in NLP and in hypnosis was that I noticed that there were a number of different science schools talking about hypnosis in different ways and basically coming up with some mutually exclusive theories about what hypnosis was, what trance was, etc. Basically, if you bought one school, the other school was simply not right. And in looking at the textbooks and at the references and the rest of that, it became clear that each of the different schools was focusing on different aspects of the phenomena that were called hypnosis or hypnotic. In other words, they're looking at these different abstract nouns and then kind of reshaping the world so that certain things will fit under that abstract noun, but not under that. It's a great way to create fuzzy lines that allows you to kind of claim territory. It's like a marketing tool. People say they're scientifically studying hypnosis, but they're not. They're creating their own little realm, their own little definitions, and then they say that's the way things are. Or you get some kind of pseudo-religious Jungian therapy hypnosis thing, and they make their own special language there. And then there's this group, and there's that group. So one of the things that I did was I had a look at how much of what was being presented as hypnosis, as hypnotic language, as trance states in themselves, all of these little boxes were things that we could point to, look at in concrete terms. And what I discovered was that there's only a very small amount of that stuff, of things that we could all agree on, things that we could all look at. So I started doing a little experiment, and it's a little experiment in deletion, basically taking out things that are asserted to be absolutely essential to the process of whatever it is you're studying, and drop it out. And you see what happens. And so I was doing this with the various kinds of hypnotic process and hypnotic theory that leads to this is the only protocol that's allowed and this is the only way things can happen. And what I discovered was that there were so many pieces of these rituals and these protocols and these bits and these pieces that you could drop out and still get a result and still have somebody that you're working with or talking with or just having a conversation with able to do the thing that they said they couldn't do, able to overcome the problem they said was impossible, able to come up with new ideas, etc. Eventually, I went to the taboo itself. The taboo was that people had to be in some one single specific state. And it only has one kind of sign on it. There's first there's fixation, and then eyes closed, and then relaxation, and then leading to catalepsy, then leading to the ability to stick a dagger through them, and they don't feel it. As if that is equal to some magical state, some prerequisite, something that has to happen before change is allowed to occur. This is BS. This is nonsense. This is idiocy. Anyway, so I wonder what happens if I stop trying to force people to go into the one true state, the one true state of trance, the one true state of light trance, the one true state of medium trance, the one true state of deep trance, the trance that's so deep that you push them in and they fall into a hole, and then you just say a few words at them and then magic happens. I said, what if this is complete nonsense? What if people don't have to be in one specific state in order to accomplish various kinds of changes and various kinds of goals? So I stopped, as my experiment, I stopped seeking trance as the single most important characteristic in a conversation with another human being. I kept everything else. I kept the use of structured communication. I kept negotiating what someone wanted. I kept finding and assembling resources and putting them together. I kept metaphor, analogy, and all the other ways of conveying information. I kept all of the language patterns and all of the processes. What I dropped was the insistence that they had to be in one state before we would start the work. And the more I did this, the more I discovered that the trance state was completely unnecessary. We seek to push them into one state probably because we're a little bit nervous about paying attention to what's actually going on in the person who's in front of us. If you really pay attention to what's going on, to the person who's in front of you, you'll notice that they're moving through many, many, many states. They'll talk about one part of the situation that they're in, and they'll have one tone of voice and one kind of nonverbal behavior. And then they'll talk about something else, and their posture will change and their tone of voice will change. And there's this dance that goes through and pattern over and over and over again. Instead of trying to force them into one state so that we feel better about all of this variety that they're presenting, when you drop that and you start to seek just what needs to happen in terms of process, you can then use the, quote, hypnotic language to help them create change, to help them find whatever it is they want, to add resources, to do all the things one would do, presumably under a necessary trance state. It's not a conclusion, it's an opinion. We'll call it an opinion. That often people are engaging in the rituals that go along with therapy and change because it makes the therapist comfortable, because it makes the person who is the change agent feel like they're the one who's most important, that they're the one who's in control. And in creating processes, and whether it's hypnosis or some other school of thought that puts a prerequisite, some ritual, some kind of endeavor, some kind of torture program that has to go on before someone is allowed to change, actually denies how human beings go through the process themselves. Another thing that I spent a lot of time studying was finding people who changed without permission, without study, without going to a therapist, people who just decided they wanted to do something and then they went ahead and did it. What I discovered was that there were similarities in terms of how motivation worked and how fear and aversion worked, certain things around what it took in order to make the decision, certain things around resources and what people had to know before they would make that step forward. So collecting all of these criteria allowed me to see that there was actually a very straightforward strategy, a kind of a generalized strategy for how people who were doing it without assistance and on their own would go ahead and do the things they wanted to do, make the changes they wanted to make. And it wasn't magic. And it didn't require some kind of deep internal sorting out. The processes, such as they were mundane, ordinary, in other words. But all the pieces had to be there. And if the pieces weren't there, then they wouldn't tend to make the change. In taking that process and incorporating it and working it with some of the things that are on the using hypnotic language, like a ninja. Yeah? You see, you can use hypnotic language bunny ears, but not necessarily for the purpose of creating a trance. You aren't obliged. It's called hypnotic because it contained various bits and pieces and elements that people in the past felt were necessary in order to create specific states. Down, up, that kind of thing. When you learn to use what you've got some NLP pieces of paper, you have some hypnosis pieces of paper, you have no pieces of paper at all. To break the spell of language, of words, to break the spell of hearing the word hypnotic and assuming that it only means one thing, or can only mean one thing, only one procedure, will not only help you to be able to work with people in more circumstances and without having the need for a quiet room, 2 chairs, a table between the two of you. Why do they always put Kleenex on a table between the client and person working? Yeah? It's almost like there's a presupposition there, that somebody's going to cry. And when do you offer the tissues anyway? Yeah? You offer tissues to somebody to get them to stop crying. Yeah? Who said crying was bad? Anyway, when you start to challenge some of the presuppositions and assumptions, you see, what you were taught and what you've read and what you've heard about are not the totality of possibilities. They're not everything that could be. They're not every way that you could use what it is you've got. It's more like, in some cases, for the people who come to me and they can only do hypnosis in one procedure, and there's only one technique that you use for this problem and another technique for that problem. When they come for advanced work, we're actually dealing with people who have been disabled. They literally, if they cannot see beyond the procedure that they've been taught and can't work from the principles that are behind it, that's the first thing that has to be relinquished, released, and let go of. This notion that we know exactly what the one and only right way is. But then the second thing is we have to get beyond this hypnotic language problem. In other words, that hypnotic language is only used in hypnosis. And the answer is no. Every single one of the components and elements within hypnotic language models are a part of ordinary conversation, ordinary discourse. Isn't it funny that you have to be trained in order to use ordinary language again, once you've tried to make it into something magical and something special and something beyond? When you take the functions of language that are there within the language patterns and you integrate them, you learn how to think with them, and you learn how to create intentional communication based on inference patterns, based on how to create examples using analogies, how to create experiences with people, how to change your own state, and then use that to change other people's. But you integrate the tools. You put them back together again. You're no longer stuck with hypnotic language is only for creating trance. So when we're talking about using hypnotic language, we're talking about breaking, tearing up that automatic link with these words are connected just with hypnosis, and taking the structures and the purposes and the intentions behind those words that got connected through historical accident to hypnosis, and replacing them, reseating them back into how human beings make decisions, how people change, how they make up worlds, and then how they go and live in them.